The evening sun hung low over the prairie, painting the sky in long strokes of copper and rose. A lone stagecoach rattled down the dusty trail, wheels carving lines into the earth like memories no wind could erase. Inside, a young woman sat with her hands clasped tight around a worn leather bag, her heart beating faster with every passing mile. The land looked the same as she remembered, wide and wild, stretching out like an unending promise. But she was different now. She had left this place years ago as a frightened girl desperate to escape her past. Now she was returning as a woman with a purpose. She had come back to marry the cowboy who saved her life. She pressed her forehead against the small window, watching the familiar shapes rise from the horizon. The old ranch fences were broken in some places and newly built in others. The distant cattle spread across the grasslands in lazy clusters. Smoke from cooking fires curled up into the sky, whispering of home. It felt strange, almost unreal, to think she had stayed away for so long. The world beyond these plains had given her new clothes, new dreams, and new scars. But no matter how far she traveled, she could not outrun the echo of that night when everything changed. It had happened near the river bend, close to a canyon where wild horses still roamed. She had been running then too, but for her life. She remembered the cold splash of water, the sound of boots behind her, the panic tightening her lungs. She would have fallen. She knew that now, had a stranger not appeared on a chestnut horse. He had not spoken much that night. He simply lifted her into the saddle and rode with a steady hand, guiding her through darkness until she reached safety. The moon had lit his face just enough for her to see the dust on his jaw, the tired strength in his eyes, the quiet courage in the way he carried himself. She never learned his name, only the mark on his saddle and the way he tipped his hat before riding away at dawn. That moment stayed with her. Through winters, through city lights, through days when her heart felt heavier than her footsteps, she promised herself she would return one day, not just to thank him, but to see if fate had left a door open between them. Now she was here carrying a letter, a ring, and a hope she was almost afraid to speak aloud. The stagecoach jerked to a stop outside the small frontier town. The main street was busier than she expected. Horses tied to hitch posts, soft dust rising with every step, women in patched skirts sweeping porches, old men with hats pulled low playing cards by the saloon window. The familiar scent of pine and smoke greeted her like a memory that refused to fade. She stepped down slowly, boots touching the ground with a tremble she hoped no one noticed. A few faces turned. Some studied her with curiosity, others with cautious recognition. She carried herself with calm confidence, but inside she was nervous. People had long memories here. Whispers followed her years ago when her world fell apart. She wondered if they still remembered that broken girl or if they would accept the woman she had become. She walked past the general store, the blacksmith, the well, each step pulling her closer to the ranch she once ran from. She carried more than a bag now. She carried questions. Would he still be there? Would he remember her? Would he accept what she came to offer? She reached the edge of town where the land opened wide again. The wind lifted her hair as if urging her forward. She paused, scanning the open fields. Somewhere beyond those rolling pastures, he was working, riding, or mending fences like he always did. She could almost hear his voice, though she had never truly known the sound of it. She wondered if he ever thought of her, or if that night was just another act of kindness he had long forgotten. As she walked, she noticed how the world here worked differently than the polished cities she had lived in. People greeted each other with nods instead of empty smiles. They spoke slower, with meaning. The ground felt real beneath her boots. She took a deep breath, letting the quiet strength of the plains steady her heart. The sun dropped further behind the hills, casting long shadows across the grass. A chill rolled through the air as dusk settled in. She followed the dirt path toward a wide wooden gate marked with a familiar symbol burned into the post. Her steps halted, her breath caught. She remembered the shape of that mark from the saddle that carried her to safety years ago. This was his land. The ranch looked larger than she remembered. Fresh boards reinforced the corral, new lanterns hung along the barn, and young horses grazed near the fence. Someone had worked hard here, building a future one season at a time. She swallowed the emotion rising in her throat. She had come so far to stand here again. She lifted her hand to open the gate, but before she touched it, she heard the slow creak of hooves behind her. She turned. A lone rider approached through the fading light. His hat pulled low, shoulders broad, posture steady. Dust clung to his coat, and the horse beneath him moved with calm power. She could not yet see his face clearly, but something in the way he held the reins made her heart race. The horse stopped a few paces away, and the rider lifted his head, shadows revealing the outline of a man she had seen only once before under the moonlight. Her breath trembled. She opened her mouth to speak, to thank him, to say why she had come back after all these years, but he looked at her with guarded eyes, as if he knew her and yet did not, as if her return had stirred something he was not ready to face. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and steady, carrying the weight of years she could not yet understand. "You shouldn't have come back here." And the wind went still. The sound of his voice unsettled her more than the long ride back to this land. She had imagined their reunion 100 different ways, but none of those thoughts prepared her for the cold distance in his tone. She steadied herself, fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. The wind carried the scent of fresh hay and distant rain, the same scent she remembered the night he saved her. She searched his face, hoping to find the same quiet strength she once trusted. But now there was something heavier in his eyes, something she could not name. She lifted her chin a little, forcing her voice to stay calm. She said she had come back to repay a promise and that she needed to speak to him. He looked down for a moment, as if weighing the truth in her words. His hand hovered near the reins, knuckles white as if he might ride away before she finished speaking. When he finally answered, his voice was softer but guarded. He said promises were dangerous on these plains, especially ones that belonged to the past. She stepped closer, stopping just short of the horse's shadow. The animal huffed, tail flicking, but the cowboy kept his gaze fixed on her, watching not with anger, but with the caution of a man who had learned to trust little. She realized then that he had changed too. The boyish gentleness she remembered from that night was gone. In its place stood a man who had carried burdens through seasons she had not seen. He dismounted slowly, boots landing in the dirt with a dull thud. The soft glow from the barn lantern revealed the lines of fatigue across his face. He rested his hand on the saddle mark. The same symbol burned into the gate. She remembered how that symbol felt beneath her palm years ago, etched into leather as he carried her across the plains. Now it felt like a signpost guiding her back to a destiny she was afraid to lose. She told him she never forgot what he did. Her voice cracked slightly, not from weakness but from truth. She explained how her life after leaving this place had been filled with restless nights, unanswered questions, and the memory of a moment that felt unfinished. He listened, not interrupting, though his expression remained unreadable. When she mentioned the letter she carried, his eyes narrowed with something like concern. He asked her who sent it. She hesitated. The wind picked up dust from the road, brushing against her coat. She said the letter came from someone at the ranch, telling her things about him, urging her to come back. His jaw tightened. He asked for the name again. She searched her memory, realizing she never saw a signature. The letter had been folded neatly inside her bag, sealed with wax, written in a rough hand that looked familiar yet strange. He stepped back a little as though the truth pulled him away. He said no one at the ranch knew anything about a letter. The workers here changed over the years, and those still loyal would never send something like that without telling him. His voice carried quiet suspicion. He asked her when the letter arrived. She told him a month ago, delivered to her boarding house in the city, left with no return address. He exhaled slowly, staring into the distance as if the fields might hold an answer. She felt a chill as she realized she may have returned not only for him, but because someone else wanted her here. She wondered how many choices in her life had been guided by unseen hands. She looked around carefully, noticing figures moving near the barn. They seemed to watch from the shadows, working silently, their attention half on chores and half on her presence. He finally motioned for her to follow him. They walked through the open gate side by side. The path was rough, lined with broken rocks and flattened grass from horse hooves. The ranch buildings stood tall and weathered, strengthened by years of storms. Smoke drifted from a small cabin near the back where supper was cooking. She watched a dog run past, barking once before disappearing behind a wagon. Inside her mind, she replayed that night at the river bend. She remembered his steady arms lifting her onto his horse, the heat of his coat wrapped around her shoulders, the way he rode without hesitation even when danger whispered behind them. She remembered the moon, his silent presence, the feeling of safety. Now, standing beside him in daylight, she sensed a different kind of danger, one that came from the past trying to catch a future unprepared. He led her to a small corral, leaning against the fence. Dust settled around their boots. He asked why she left so suddenly years ago. She swallowed hard. She said the town had turned against her after the incident, rumors spreading about who chased her that night. She explained how the sheriff back then refused to help, how certain men watched her every move, how no one believed her except the stranger on horseback. Leaving was the only way to survive. He nodded, his gaze distant as if he remembered those days too well. He told her the plains changed after she left. Some men vanished, others returned with new allegiances. The sheriff retired, replaced by someone tougher but less patient. The ranch faced trouble too, the kind that comes quietly in the dark. He said he stayed because someone had to. There was responsibility here, land to protect, families who depended on him. He looked tired when he said it, as though those burdens had cost pieces of his soul. The sky deepened to indigo as night approached. Lanterns flickered across porches. Horses settled. Workers headed to the bunkhouse, murmuring in low voices. The land grew quiet, except for distant coyotes calling from the hills. The cowboy finally looked at her fully, eyes searching hers with a mix of memory and unfamiliar distance. He said he never expected her to return. He said he tried to forget what happened near the river bend, not because it didn't matter, but because remembering made things harder. She felt her throat tighten. She asked if he ever wished that night ended differently. He did not answer right away. The silence stretched like a stretched rope between them. Ready to snap or bind, she reached into her bag and pulled out the letter. She handed it to him carefully. He unfolded it and read in silence. The more his eyes moved across the paper, the darker his expression grew. When he finished, he folded it slowly and held it in his hand, knuckles tense. He said the message was written in a style used by someone he once trusted but no longer spoke to. Someone connected to the danger that chased her years ago. Someone who wanted her back here now for a reason neither of them understood. Before she could ask more, a shout came from near the barn. A rider galloped into the yard, dust flying behind the horse. The ranch hands stepped forward, some reaching for ropes or tools as if preparing for trouble. The rider stopped in front of them, chest heaving, eyes wide with urgency. He said trouble was coming from the north trail and that they did not have much time. The cowboy turned toward her. Voice steady but grave, he said her return was no accident. She felt the ground beneath her shift, as if the past had not just followed her home but had arrived ahead of her. Waiting in the shadows of the plains and somewhere beyond the hills, trouble moved closer. Just as night settled over the ranch, dust still hung in the air from the rider's arrival, and the ranch lights flickered against the darkening horizon. She watched the cowboy step forward, speaking in low tones with the rider while the rest of the ranch hands gathered around with guarded expressions. Though she could not hear every word, she caught enough to understand that something had been stirring in the hills for days. Tracks found near the river, broken fences on the north side, cattle missing without a trace. None of it felt random. Every sign pointed back to the past she thought she left behind. The cowboy turned to her, his voice steady though his eyes carried a storm. He told her there were still people out there who remembered what happened years ago, people who might hold grudges or unfinished business. She wanted to ask who exactly they were, but he shifted away before she could speak. The ranch hands mounted horses and rode out with lanterns swinging in the night. She stood alone beside the gate, trying to understand how her return connected to trouble none of them fully understood. She followed him toward the barn where he saddled another horse, movements sharp and focused. She asked if he thought the letter was bait. He paused only a second before admitting it could be. Someone could have wanted her back in this land for reasons that had nothing to do with marriage or gratitude. The thought made her chest tighten. She wondered if she had put him and everyone here at risk by returning. But before guilt could swallow her, he looked at her with a calm firmness and told her she was not the cause, only part of the chain that had started long before she ever left. He handed her a lantern and told her to stay in the small cabin near the corral for the night. He said it was safer than wandering or returning to town alone. She hesitated, not wanting to hide while others faced danger, but he insisted with a quiet authority that made it hard to argue. She followed his directions, walking through the cold night toward the small cabin where smoke still drifted from a chimney. The air smelled like pine ash and wild sage, a scent that wrapped around her like a memory. Inside, the cabin was simple: one bed, a table, a lantern, and a wool blanket folded neatly near the window. She sat down, hands shaking slightly. The letter weighed heavy in her pocket. She unfolded it once more and read the rough handwriting. The words praised the cowboy, urged her to return, mentioned honor, safety, and a future unfinished. But reading it now, under the flickering lantern, the tone felt different, almost like a warning disguised as an invitation. She noticed a faint smudge at the bottom corner, something she never paid attention to before. It looked like dirt or dried river clay. That detail pulled her thoughts back to the canyon where she was rescued. She wondered if the person who wrote this letter was someone who had been there that night hiding in the dark. Outside, the wind rattled the window. Hoofbeats thundered in the distance. She blew out the lantern and stood silently near the door. The ranch felt stretched thin under the weight of unseen eyes. Meanwhile, far out on the north trail, the cowboy and his men rode under a sky full of faint stars. The air was sharp and quiet, broken only by the sound of hooves striking rock. The land seemed peaceful at first, but he knew better than to trust silence. He remembered too many long nights when danger waited without a sound. His thoughts drifted back to the girl he once carried to safety. She had changed, but so had he. He tried not to dwell on the past, yet seeing her again reopened feelings he buried beneath work and responsibility. One of the ranch hands asked him why she returned. The cowboy only said she came back for answers. The man rode in silence for a while before saying trouble started not long after rumors spread that she was heading home. The cowboy did not respond, but the idea settled heavily in his mind. If someone was watching her movements in the city, they might have been watching him too. They reached the broken fence line. The posts were splintered as if struck by something heavy. The ground nearby carried hoof prints, but not from cattle. The tracks were scattered and overlapping, like horses circling under cover of darkness. The cowboy knelt down, touching the dirt with the back of his hand. The earth was still warm. Whoever came here had been here recently. He stood slowly, eyes narrowing toward the hills. Nothing moved, but he did not feel alone. Back at the cabin, she lay awake, staring at the wood ceiling. She heard distant whistles, voices calling across the ranch, then fading. She wondered if she had the right to hope for a future here. She came back with dreams of love and gratitude, but reality now felt more like a storm gathering before dawn. She thought about the cowboy's expression when he saw the letter. That look was not simply confusion. It was fear mixed with recognition, as if he knew exactly who sent it but could not say the name aloud. The night grew colder. She pulled the blanket tighter around her and finally drifted into a restless sleep. Near dawn, the cowboy and his men returned, tired and covered in dust. They tied their horses and spoke quietly among themselves. She stepped out of the cabin, waking to the sound of boots and murmurs. He approached her with the tired look of a man who carried too many responsibilities. He said they did not find whoever broke the fence, but fresh tracks suggested the riders were watching from higher ground. He believed they were organized, not just wanderers. He wanted to speak with the new sheriff. Though he did not trust him completely, she walked alongside him toward the main house. Workers gathered tools, whispering to each other. She noticed that some avoided making eye contact, as if they were unsure whether to welcome her or fear what followed her. She tried to speak to one of them, a young man sweeping the porch. He looked up briefly and said there used to be talk about that night years ago, whispers about why those men chased her. Some said the chase was about land claims, others said money, others mentioned something taken from a locked chest. She felt a chill. She had never known why they came after her. All she remembered was running. She asked the cowboy if he knew the truth. He paused at the doorway and said there were things she never learned because leaving was the safest choice. He said the men who chased her were not after her at first, but after someone she lived with back then. They believed she knew where something valuable was hidden. When she escaped, the trouble shifted to him when he helped her. That night changed the path of his life too. She stared at him, realizing that saving her had cost him more than she ever knew. A horse neighed sharply from the pasture. A rider approached fast, dust rising behind him like a warning. The cowboy stepped forward again, shoulders tense. The rider slowed just enough to speak, saying there were strangers camped near the canyon, watching the valley. He said they had guns, covered wagons, and a fire burning all night. He said they were waiting for something or someone. She looked at the cowboy, fear meeting determination in their eyes, and she understood that coming back to marry the man who saved. Her life was no longer just a promise of love. It was stepping into a storm that had been waiting for her. Return. The morning sky carried a pale gray light, the kind that made the world feel unsettled before the sun fully rose. She walked beside the cowboy in silence, both of them listening to the distant rumble of hooves from the hills. The rider's report about armed strangers near the canyon lingered in her mind like a warning carved across the land. Each step she took seemed heavier, as if the ground itself carried memories of the night she fled so long ago. He led her toward the main house, where maps and old tools lay scattered on a wide wooden table. Some were new, marked with fresh ink showing fence lines and grazing roots. Others were older, yellowed with age, corners torn like they had been handled in moments of haste. He traced a finger along the trail leading to the canyon and said that whoever camped there knew the land well. That spot was hidden from most vantage points, shielded by rock formations and dense brush. It was a place chosen with purpose, not accident. She stood beside him, feeling the weight of his voice, the tension in his shoulders. She wanted to help but did not know how. Her presence had stirred old wounds, and yet she could not bring herself to leave. She told him she was ready to face whatever followed her. He looked up slowly, eyes softening for a brief moment. Though the burden in them did not fade, he said there were things she needed to hear before decisions were made. They stepped outside to the back porch, where the land stretched into rolling fields. The wind moved through the grass, whispering across the plains. He told her about the men who chased her years ago. They were not simple outlaws, nor wandering troublemakers. They worked under someone who sought control of land and trade routes across the frontier. Control meant power, and power meant shaping towns and ranches the way he wanted. When she escaped that night, she carried information without knowing it. Something she witnessed, something she overheard, something that tied her to a struggle bigger than either of them realized. She tried to remember every detail, every sound from that night, but all she recalled clearly was fear and the feel of his coat around her shoulders. He said the men never found what they were searching for. Their plans stopped, but not for good. Time had passed, alliances shifted, and now, with her return to the ranch, the past had begun to move again. Before she could answer, a soft whistle echoed from the corral. A ranch hand called for the cowboy, signaling him to come. She followed as he walked toward the horses. Two men stood beside a saddled Mustang holding a torn scrap of cloth. They said they found it near the creek, snagged on a branch. The cloth was dark, weathered, and marked with a symbol burned into the fabric. The cowboy's face grew still when he saw it. He knew the mark. She asked what it meant. He hesitated, then said it belonged to a man he once trusted, someone who rode beside him in younger days before their paths divided. That man disappeared after the night she fled. He took his own trail and built new alliances. If he was back, it meant the danger was not only tied to her past, but also to the cowboys. The two of them shared a long, heavy silence. The ranch grew restless as word spread. Workers sharpened tools, checked gates, moved cattle closer to the inner fields. Women and children stayed inside while lanterns were set outside for warning signals. Even the dogs paced like they sensed trouble more clearly than people. She watched everyone prepare, wishing she understood how to help, feeling torn between guilt and determination. As night approached again, the cowboy saddled his own horse. He told her he needed to ride to the canyon to see the camp for himself. He would not go alone, but he could not take the entire ranch force, not when the threat might move while they were gone. She stepped forward, asking to ride with him. He shook his head firmly. He said there were too many unknowns, and she was a target whether she understood why or not, she argued. But he placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle yet decisive. He told her staying was not running. Staying protected the ranch, and gave him peace of mind while he searched for answers. She watched him ride away into the fading light, a small group of riders following behind. Hoofbeats thundered down the trail until they faded into the distance, alone again. She stood at the porch with the letter in her hand. The words seemed to change meaning the longer she stared at them, like a message written to be understood only after everything unfolded. She wondered if the letter was meant to protect her or deliver her into danger. Later that night, unable to sleep, she walked to the barn. The lanterns cast long shadows across the floorboards. The horses shifted and exhaled softly, restless. She traced her fingers along the saddle with the ranch mark, thinking of the cowboy riding through the darkness. She remembered his warning about promises, and how the plains could turn on a person faster than the wind. A noise snapped her attention to the back of the barn. A shadow moved, quiet and cautious. She stepped back, heart racing. A figure appeared from behind a stack of hay, hands raised to show no harm. It was a young rider from the ranch, but he looked shaken, sweat on his brow. He told her he saw someone watching from the tree line beyond the barn. Someone dressed in dark clothing who rode off the moment he realized he wasn't alone. The rider claimed he tried to follow, but the stranger moved fast and vanished into the night. She felt everything tightening inside her again. Trouble was not waiting at the canyon. Trouble was already here. Circling quietly, the rider asked her why those men from years ago came after her in the first place. She opened her mouth to answer but stopped. The truth was she still didn't fully know. She only knew fear and escape. She wondered if the key to everything was locked somewhere in her memories. Far away at the canyon, the cowboy and his men slowed their horses. Fires burned low within a circle of wagon wheels. Silhouettes moved beyond the flames, pacing, waiting. The cowboy stayed hidden in the brush, watching, recognizing voices carried by the wind. One voice stopped him cold, familiar, a man he once called brother in spirit. The same man whose symbol was burned on the scrap of cloth. The cowboy clenched his jaw. The past he avoided was now staring at him across the firelight. Back at the ranch, dawn approached once more. The night felt endless. She stood outside the cabin, hands wrapped around her coat. The sky held no peace, and her heart beat faster with every passing minute. She heard hoofbeats, faint but steady, coming from the trail, one rider returning too fast. She stepped forward, breath tight, waiting to see who approached and what news he carried. Somewhere between the rising light and the dust of the trail, the story she came back to finish was about to collide with everything she tried to escape. And the moment before truth breaks is always the quietest. The rider came into view through the morning haze, pushing his horse hard across the open field. Dust lifted behind him like a warning carried by the rising sun. She took a step forward, hands trembling as she braced herself for whatever news he brought. When he finally reached the ranch, he pulled the reins sharply and gasped for breath, speaking between uneven words. He said the group at the canyon had scattered before the cowboys' party arrived, disappearing into the hills as if they knew they were being watched. But there was more. Their leader had left a message burned into a tree trunk near the old river crossing, a message meant for the cowboy, hinting that the next move would happen closer to the ranch. The rider said the cowboy was on his way back and that he told everyone to stay alert. She felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Whatever had been building for years was no longer hiding in distant shadows. It was coming to an end, one way or another. She waited by the gate, heart unsteady, until she saw the cowboy and his men returning. They rode slowly, tired from the long night, but with a purpose in their eyes that had not been there before. The cowboy dismounted and walked toward her, his coat dusted, his hat lowered against the morning light. He said he finally understood who had stirred the trouble and why. The leader of the men at the canyon was the same person who once rode beside him, the same man who vanished after helping the group that chased her years ago. He had left the plains to build alliances with traders and outlaws, trying to create his own root of power. Now he wanted to reclaim unfinished plans and use her return as the spark. The cowboy said the man believed she still held knowledge of something lost that night, something hidden when she ran. But the truth was simpler. She had never carried treasure, evidence, or secrets. What she carried was memory, the fact that she lived to tell what she saw. That alone made her a threat. The cowboy glanced toward the distant hills. He said they would come again, but this time the ranch was ready, and she was not alone. He admitted that he feared seeing her again because he thought it would drag him back into a fight he wanted to forget. But facing it now made him realize that saving her years ago was not a mistake. It was the beginning of something that mattered. She listened quietly, feeling a warmth settle in her chest. She told him she never came back to cause trouble or reopen wounds. She came because she could not forget the courage he showed that night. She came because a life built far away never felt complete knowing she walked away without thanking the man who saved her. She came because she hoped the story between them was not finished. He looked at her for a long moment, and the guarded tension he carried finally began to fade. He reached for her hand gently, as if testing whether the past could finally give way to something more before she could speak. Ranch hands called out again, spotting riders on the ridge. But this time the approaching figures rode slow, unarmed, holding white cloth tied to their saddles. The cowboy stepped to the front of the property with several men beside him. She stood behind, watching cautiously as the riders drew closer. She recognized the face of the man who once led the group that chased her all those years ago. His eyes carried exhaustion instead of hunger for power. He dismounted and walked forward alone. He said his days of fighting had ended. The alliances he built fell apart, and he was left with nothing but regret. He said he came not to threaten the ranch, but to demand answers from the man who once rode beside him. They spoke quietly, exchanging words she could not hear from where she stood. At one point, the cowboy turned to look at her. The other man followed his gaze and lowered his head, acknowledging the truth he once refused to see. He said he used her as a reason to chase power, when in truth she had nothing to do with his ambitions. He apologized, not asking for forgiveness, but for clarity. When he finished, he mounted his horse and rode away without raising a weapon, his men following behind him into the early light. The land finally grew quiet. Workers returned to their chores. Horses settled. The ranch exhaled as though the plains themselves had been holding their breath. The cowboy walked back to her. His shoulders no longer weighed down. He said the trouble had passed, though caution would always be part of life out here. What mattered now was moving forward, not looking back. She felt tears sting her eyes. She told him she wanted to stay, not because of fear, not because of danger, but because she finally understood where she belonged. He brushed a strand of hair from her face and said she never needed permission to stay. The ranch had room for her, not as someone rescued long ago, but as someone building a future alongside those she cared for. Days turned into weeks, and the ranch slowly returned to its rhythm. She helped in the barns, learned the land again, and found her place among the workers who once watched her with uncertainty. They came to see her not as a reminder of trouble, but as part of the life they protected. On a warm afternoon, near the same gate where she first faced the cowboy upon her return, he asked her something simple. He said that if she still wished to marry the man who saved her life, she did not need to wait any longer. She smiled, placing her hand against his chest, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath. She said she did not come to repay a debt, but to choose a life with him. They married on the plains under open sky, surrounded by horses grazing and lanterns swinging from fence posts. The past faded into the horizon like the sun melting behind the hills. The land felt peaceful again, filled with promise instead of shadows. She had come back searching for closure. Instead, She found home, and the cowboy who once rescued her from darkness now walked beside her in the light, building a life not born from fear, but from love, forgiveness, and the strength of second chances.